What's up, guys? My name is Sai, and I'm a rocket engineer. And in this video, I'm going to talk about just 5 random things that I learned along the way designing rockets. So, as I said, these are just 5 quick lessons that I just wanted to jump on here and talk about. It's not comprehensive of everything that I learned along the way, but these are things that came to mind recently as I've been working, and I just wanted to share my thoughts with you. So, one of the first big things I wanted to highlight was just how much has to go right for a rocket to launch properly. A lot of things have to go right. So, let's check the history real quick. We'll take the Apollo missions for a second. So these missions were the missions that eventually ended up putting man on the moon. And there were a lot of mistakes made along the way. A lot of tests had to be done and big risks taken to get astronauts to the moon. I guess I wanted to mention real quick, people did end up dying in the early Apollo missions. Like Apollo 1 ended up causing a launch pad fire and killed 3 very well-trained astronauts. So yeah, when I say there was risk involved, I mean there was a ton of risk involved. Now let's come over to Apollo 11. This is the infamous mission that put man on the moon. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. And they were on board the Saturn V rocket.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. We have a liftoff. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
They had to launch into space, they had to deploy the lunar spacecraft, they had to get to the moon and its gravity well, they had to deploy the lander from the Columbia, and then they had to land on the moon on the Eagle, take off from the moon back into orbit with all the rocks and samples that they had collected, and then they had to mate the Eagle with the Columbia again. Now the Columbia was piloted by Michael Collins, and the Eagle was piloted by Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong. After they mated the spacecraft, they had to get back to Earth. They had to take everything that they'd collected, all the science that they had done, and they had to come back to Earth without burning up in re-entry or being just cast out into space. And the president even wrote a speech here just in case the mission went south and they didn't make it back. Because this was also in the height of the Cold War, so tensions were very high. Morale was very dependent on these missions. So fast forward to today. Now, deploying payloads in orbit is still incredibly hard. The environment hasn't gotten easier, we've just gotten better at it. We're better at learning from our mistakes, we're better at learning from the things we did right, and we're better at mitigating our design. And there's a lot that goes into deploying a payload in a very specific orbit. You have to do your ground checks, you have to lift off, you have to separate the upper and lower stage, you have to take the payload to the specific orbit, you have to release it in that specific orbit, you gotta take the spacecraft and you gotta dump it into its graveyard orbit where it'll remain for the rest of the time. And once the payload has reached its point, that's when you can call the mission a success. So we take a lot of mitigation steps here. Let's take air travel, for example. The reason it's so safe is because so much mitigation is done. A lot of systems engineering processes are in place to ensure that the product is ushered through the life cycle properly, with all the design steps taken into account, all the risks are assessed. Really every possible failure mode that you could think of has been brainstormed at a certain point. So, come to the second thing that I want to talk about. It's the amount of teamwork and communication involved to bringing together an integrated vehicle. A lot of people have to come together to make this work. You have to have your propulsion to make the boom that shoots the rocket off into space. You have to have your avionics to measure and telemeter everything that's going on, to track where the rocket is during its mission, to make sure it's not going off course, and appropriately assess its trajectory. You have to have your ground systems to handshake with the rocket, provide its initial power, and make sure that the rocket's health is good, such that we can go ahead and launch it, make sure all the tanks are set. And then you have the brains of the rocket, which is the flight software. The flight computer dictates everything the rocket does. Without it, you have a dumb rocket. Very important. And then you have the actual structural design of the rocket. They have to make sure that it can withstand the hostile environment, withstand all these temperatures that you're going through, the different changes, the amount of thrust that's being generated. And that's just to list a handful of things. You've also got your business side of things. You've got your supply chain, your finances, your handling contracts, your customer control, which goes into the third thing I want to talk about. There's a lot of politics involved, and you interface with the government pretty regularly to make sure you're meeting the standards, because we're not Russia or China. We're not just going to drop fuselages on civilians. That's just not a thing that happens in the Western world. there's a lot of things to be taken account there as far as safety standards. And then there's also the facet of making sure that the payload isn't hurt at all during the mission. Whenever you hail a taxi, you want to make sure you get there in one place. It's the same way whenever a customer comes to a rocket company and asks them to launch a vehicle. The payload's health is very important because it costs a lot of money. Now, the third thing that I learned along the way is just how smart people are and how knowledge is passed between generations. Now, when it comes to software engineering, the new knowledge tends to surpass the old knowledge. Whereas when it comes to stuff like systems engineering for rockets, the old knowledge is really compounded upon. It's very key and it's very integral. So one person I really look up to is my lead, and he's been working for about 15 years now. Started as an avionics engineer and worked his way to understand the larger system as a whole. And now he just has this incredible wealth of knowledge that whenever I ask him questions, I can just keep digging and learn a tremendous amount of history and also a tremendous amount of engineering and lessons learned along the way. As a result, the knowledge is built upon as we go along. And the last thing that I learned along the way, and by far one of the most important things, is that the industry thrives off of competition. Right now, this is the best time to be in the launch industry because everyone wants to go to space. Every company is becoming a space company. It used to be that there were a lot more launches than there were people that wanted to ride a rocket. But now at this point, so much of our infrastructure relies on what we have up in space that everyone wants to go to space. Everyone wants to buy a launch. So these industries are getting insanely competitive. So SpaceX, for example, they fly to LEO, which is a low energy orbit. And they're really good at it, so that's what they're gonna keep selling to the customer. They're gonna keep selling launches that take the customer to LEO, and they're gonna try and save as much money as they possibly can and make as much money from the customer as they possibly can. So you've got all these different companies. You've got SpaceX, ULA, Relativity, ESA, you've got NASA, so much. And this is a very good time to be in the launch industry. All right, that's it, guys. 5 random things I learned along the way. And if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button below and subscribe if you want to see more. And I will see you guys at the next video.